I'm now going to go on to an examination of these different issue about the sanctity of life ethic, and that is whether the way in which it deals with difficult cases, with problem cases, is in fact consistent with the premises of that ethic, or whether they show that we can't really defend the idea that it's always wrong to end the life of an innocent human being. And this discussion is a preliminary to prepare the ground for what we're going to move on to in the next class, which will be an interview with Dr. April Dvorets, who is an experienced neonatologist, that is a physician who is specialized in the care of newborn infants, in many cases infants born extremely prematurely who have medical problems as a result of that premature birth. In other cases, infants born with some abnormality or some particular medical problem. And people like Dr. Dvorets are constantly making life or death decisions for their patients. And the question is, on what basis are they making those decisions? Do they have to take into account the quality of life that those infants will have, or can they actually operate on the basis of saying every human life is sacrosanct and equally valuable and equally to be protected, and equal medical efforts to be made to maintain its life? So I won't specifically be talking about those cases immediately. They will come into this discussion, as you will see, and prepare the ground for that interview that we'll have in the next class. Now, let's start with the idea of the equal value of human life, which is something that defenders of the sanctity of life ethic commonly say. It's a common belief, they say, as quoted here from Pope John Paul II, from one of his encyclicals, in other words, a document of the highest authority in the Church, that as far as the right to life is concerned, every innocent human being is absolutely equal to all others. That's the statement, and the question is that really something that is applied in practice, that we can apply in practice, that we would want to apply in practice? It would seem that if we believe that every human life is absolutely equal in value, we ought to put equal effort into prolonging the lives of all human beings and not take account of differences in their quality. And if we don't do that, then the question is, why not? Doesn't that show that we are not adhering to the sanctity of human life ethic, to the claim that John Paul II made? So here's a case that I'm going to begin with, and it's a case that took place right here in New Jersey, and it's sometimes regarded as a foundational case for the development of bioethics in the United States, the case of Karen Ann Quinlan. You see here Karen Quinlan's parents looking at a newspaper article about their daughter, whose photo you can see there. So this is a case that took place in the 1970s, right at the beginning of the development of interest in bioethics. As you can see, Karen Quinlan was 21 years of age when she went into PVS, persistent vegetative state, and she was put on a respirator. It's not absolutely clear why she went into a persistent vegetative state, but there were some suggestions about having taken drugs and alcohol together, something of that sort. In any case, she collapsed and was found to be in this state where she could not be roused, she was not conscious, she needed, it was thought anyway, that she needed a respirator to breathe, so she was put in hospital on a respirator, and the respirator enabled her to breathe, but there was no sign of progress in terms of any return to consciousness. And as the months went by, doctors gave up hope that there would be any kind of return to consciousness. And at that point, her parents asked the hospital to withdraw the respirator to allow their daughter to die. She was not brain dead. She was, as I said, in a persistent vegetative state. There were parts of her brain that were still functioning, so she didn't satisfy the criteria for brain death. But they thought that there was no point in her continued life, and asked for the respirator to be withdrawn in the belief that she would then stop breathing and die. And in making this decision, the parents were advised by their priest. The parents were Roman Catholics, and they sought advice from their priest, who told them that this was a permissible thing to request because the use of the respirator is an extraordinary means of life support. So the distinction that is being relied on here is the distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means of life support. And in giving the parents this advice, the priest was applying an accepted doctrine, accepted by the Roman Catholic Church and accepted to some extent outside adherents of the Church, that there is a moral distinction between the use of ordinary means of life support and the use of extraordinary means. And that while we have an obligation to use ordinary means to support life, so that, for example, if we had somebody who could not swallow, who could not eat by themselves, who, let's say, was paralyzed, we would have to feed them. That would be an ordinary means of life support. And it would be wrong to say that we can stop feeding them because we don't think there's any point in their continued life. But the use of a respirator is generally regarded as not an ordinary means of life support, but medical technology, extraordinary, and the doctrine is that it was not obligatory to maintain it. And in reaching a decision on this, the parents went to court, to New Jersey court, and not only the priest, but they were supported also by the local Bishop of New Jersey, Bishop Lawrence Casey, who said in his evidence to the court that Quinlan has no reasonable hope of recovery from a comatose state. As I've said, he said the respirator is an extraordinary means of treatment, and hence the parents' request is morally correct. So they had authority for this decision. The question is, can that decision be explained and understood without a reference to the quality of Karen Quinlan's life, which of course was essentially zero. She was comatose or in a persistent vegetative state. She had no positive quality to her life at all. So note that the bishop does say that she has no reasonable hope of recovery from her comatose state, which suggests that that is what's influencing him. Of course, if she did have a hope of recovery, the parents would not have wished to withdraw the respirator. So it does seem that the lack of quality of life is playing a role in this decision, rather than just the nature of the means being employed. Well, what in fact happened was the court agreed to withdraw the respirator, but the doctors were wrong about one fact. They were wrong about the claim that Karen Quinlan needed the respirator in order to remain alive. That is, that if you withdrew the respirator, she would stop breathing. She didn't. And in fact, she lived for 9 years beyond the withdrawal of the respirator. On the other hand, they were not wrong about what you might consider to be the more important fact, which is that she never recovered consciousness. Now, how did she live for 9 years after the respirator was withdrawn? Well, obviously, as I said, she breathed on her own. She had enough brain activity to breathe on her own. But she was unconscious, so she had to be fed. And as I said, feeding is regarded generally as an ordinary means of treatment. Now, there's some debate, in fact, as to whether feeding a patient through a tube is an ordinary means of treatment or an extraordinary means. So some people might have argued that because she was being fed through a tube rather than with a spoonful of food put in her mouth all the time, that was extraordinary and could have been withdrawn. But Karen Quinlan's parents did not take that view. They did not oppose the use of the feeding tube, and that was possibly on the basis of the advice they had from their priest or from Bishop Casey. So the question here is, why draw that distinction? What's the sense of that distinction in terms of what's extraordinary? I've put here also the words proportionate and disproportionate, which are words that are sometimes used in the same context. But the words proportionate and disproportionate actually make clearer what's going on in this distinction, because you have to say proportionate or disproportionate to what? And then the answer is, well, to the kind of life that is being prolonged. So that does suggest very clearly that it's a quality of life judgment that is being made, that the use of a feeding tube, or of a respirator for that matter too, on somebody who was fully conscious and said, I want to go on living and at least I can read or something like that, even if I have to stay in bed, and that's worth doing, then you would say, well, it's not disproportionate to that preserving that life. But if it's disproportionate to preserving the life of someone who's unconscious, then the critical thing is, are they having sufficient quality of life to make it worth doing that? And that's a quality of life judgment, not one that accepts the idea that all human life is of equal value. Because if you thought all human life was of equal value, then the 9 years that Karen Quinlan lived, completely comatose, after her respirator was withdrawn, were just as valuable as, let's say, the last 9 years that you've lived and all of the things that you've been doing in those 9 years. But that's really pretty hard to believe when you think about it. So it seems to me that this distinction doesn't really work, that it does rely on a tacit quality of life distinction. And I don't think that the question I put here, the question, was the intention relevant? I think that the intention was to allow Karen Quinlan to die when the parents wanted the respirator withdrawn. And it would have been the same if they'd asked for the feeding tube to be withdrawn, as was the case, for instance, with Tony Bland. It's hard to say the intention was not to burden Karen Quinlan with the respirator, as if somehow that was burdensome, when she was completely unconscious and unaware of that burden.